Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Groovy, Laidback and Nasty. It's been described as a brilliant book by one of the best culture writers in the UK, by friend of the show Miranda Sawyer. From dazzling electronic futurism to pioneering post-rock via pop, metal, bassline, bleep, techno and generation-defining indie rock, Sheffield has long been a crucible for world-leading music. Delighted to say that the author of Groovy, Laidback and Nasty, Daniel Dylan Ray, joins me live now. Good morning to you, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Presumably are you in Sheffield, God's own country this morning, or where are you?
I am indeed, yeah. I've just got back from walking the dog in the nice sunshine, so yes, I am very much here.
So why are you so eminently qualified to write this particular tome?
Well, I mean, I guess that's for other people to decide. I've been living in Sheffield over 20 years now, so I know the city. I've just about earned my passport, I think. And I've been writing about music, professionally for well over a decade, and I've been writing bits of Sheffield music history there that have been sort of untold. And it was just sort of after writing article after article, I kind of realised maybe there's a bigger story to be told, connecting the dots, and more than anything, it's sort of less me thinking about that I'm the most qualified person to do it, but more nobody else had done it, and it felt like this huge gaping hole in sort of British music history, really.
Because if you think about it, you go musical cities and you go, oh yeah, okay, so we got London, we got Manchester, we've got Bristol, we got Liverpool. They've all got recognised musical things. But if you think about the music scene coming out of Sheffield, it is so different. You've got for everything from techno, Cabaret Voltaire, the Human League, Def Leppard, for goodness sake. Big hair metal per se. There is such a smorgasbord, I think the Swedes would call it, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why Sheffield has perhaps not been as documented as much as other cities, because it's a bit more difficult to put a neat bow around it and describe it, because it's not synonymous with one genre, one scene, one sound. It's always been hugely eclectic. There's a lot of individuality, a lot of originators that have come from the city. So on one hand, that's an amazing thing, but yeah, I think it makes it a bit more difficult to sort of neatly summarise, which, is probably my feeling as to why maybe it's not been as universally recognised as much as a sort of music city, because it's so eclectic.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, because a lot of people won't they sort of go a bit sort of numb when it gets to Sheffield and dare I mention in the same sentence, Leeds, because we kind of it's a bit like Derby. You kind of know where they are, but but you're not quite sure. Whereas in Liverpool, you can define that. Bristol, you can define that. Glasgow, you see what I'm saying? So if you said what's Sheffield what's known for, people probably go, well, steelworks maybe. That's about, and then they sort of hit a blank, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's certainly been an issue in the past. Yeah, I think that was one of the motivations for the book as well, to sort of show actually what an incredibly strong musical identity the city's had. Consistently for about 40, 50 years in a row, every decade, Sheffield had a major breakout star that was a global success, from Joe Cocker conquering Woodstock through to the Arctic Monkeys, every decade there was a breakout star. But again, because they're all so different musically, from synth pop to indie, it's kind of like, you can't, it's like Birmingham, for example, home of metal. That's a very easy, succinct thing to describe it. It's where heavy metal was born. You can't really sum up Sheffield that quickly. So yeah, I think for a long time it's been synonymous with steel, but I think, hopefully, I think that there's a changing attitude there, that people are maybe being aware that it's known for a lot more than that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it. So when I was reading the NME, back in as a spotty teen, sort of verging on the goth in the 70s, Sheffield was like, we had Human League coming, Cabaret Voltaire, all those bands. But it was because I'm trying to explain this to the youth these days. But these industrial northern towns, they weren't sort of, Liverpool's docks were dangerous. These are the great, the industrial centres of Leeds, Sheffield, and where I'm from, Stoke-on-Trent, were decaying. And therefore it wasn't, that was the sort of music, was because nothing exists in a vacuum, so that was reflecting the situation that they were in, Dan.
Yeah, totally. And it also as well, I think you've got, in Sheffield in particular, you've got the decline of the steelworks coincided with the ascension of all this music being made in the city. And a lot of the music being made is in those spaces that were becoming derelict because they were no longer, in Sheffield, we've got what we call little Mestas factories, which are like little individual workshops that, someone who had one job in the process might work on a specific tool or whatever. Yeah. So Cabaret Voltaire had their own studio in an old cutlery factory that they took over, as did the Human League, as did Clock DVA. So all this sort of like groundbreaking, pioneering, quite futuristic music was, created in dilapidated, even like a group like ABC who were sort of, associated with this sort of incandescent, super glossy pop music, that was carved out in a derelict house in Sheffield, that was literally condemned because it was in such bad shape. So, yeah, it's a weird one. I think with Sheffield, you've got sort of two responses, really. Either you embrace the sort of gritty, industrial, austere surroundings and you make music that reflects that. So Cabs, Clock DVA, that dark, more brooding stuff. Or you've got your ABCs and your Human Leagues or whatever that are like, well, actually, we want something else. We're going to, we're shooting for Vegas kind of thing.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Especially with Lexicon of Love, because, I remember that when that came out, and it was basically in the new CD players of every yuppie in their Golf GTI, and you would have thought they'd have sprung fully formed from Flam, wouldn't you, from Fulham? But no, they're Sheffield born and bred.
Yeah, absolutely. And also as well, the band that they formed out of was called Vice Versa, who were much more in that mold of like Cabs, early Human League, like experimental electronic music, and they kind of, they got a bit fed up and decided, they fell in love with Nile Rodgers and Chic and, there was a lot of the music, the mutant disco music coming out in New York at the time on labels like Z Records, James Chance and things like that. And there was a bit of a shift around 1980 where a lot of Sheffield bands decided to get funky. So it was like there was this split. Some went darker, some went funkier. And yeah, I don't know, of all the funky ones, I guess ABC is probably the most well known.
Yeah, because Karl Marx said religion is the opium of the people. But if you're in a situation that isn't a lot of fun, you want to hit the dance floor and, get rid of, you want to get rid of what's going on in the world around you. What better way to escapism? And it was, and as I said before, the early 80s, it wasn't all red braces and buying your own house for a lot of us. It was hard work, Dan.
Oh, massively, yeah. And I think even more so as the 80s went on in Sheffield. Obviously, you've got miners' strikes going on. You've got later what would be, Orgreave and then later Hillsborough. There's a connection between that. Sheffield was a very tough time, huge unemployment. A lot of broken communities and stuff. And so, yeah, and it's interesting because in a way it's one of the most inherently politicised cities in the UK, but actually you look at it and not a lot of explicitly political music came out of it. I think when you look at stuff from the 80s, it was a lot of escapism stuff. It was, as you say, people in bleak surroundings thinking, let's especially when you start to get into the more dance electronic era. I think it was a warp and all that kind of stuff. It was a means of escape for people who were living in pretty tough, challenging circumstances. So yeah, absolutely, it was a pushback against surroundings in a lot of instances.
But at the same time, we have Heaven 17 who play it brilliantly because on one side you've got from Penthouse, from Pavement to Penthouse, and we've got Fascist Groove thing on one hand, and then the Mighty Temptation, which is just a tub thumpingly good dance, soul dance track. And so you can have your cake and eat it as they say.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. That's a good example. Yeah, it's a little bit of an anomaly, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Ironically, because, Fascist Groove thing was banned by the BBC when it came out because of, the line Fascist God in Motion, because obviously written in response to Reagan's inauguration in 81. And ironically, it ended up doing better in America because they didn't get banned there in the dance chart. But yeah, no, that's a perfect example, actually, of politics and groove coexisting harmoniously in the city, yeah, for sure.
So what does the Britpop and that the real sort of indie explosion do? Because we've got pulp, haven't we, coming out? And Sheffield's got this thing about being, whereas everybody else is kind of mad for it. There's an academic edge to what's coming out with pulp and that there, Jarvis, isn't there?
Yeah, it's funny, yeah, we associate Pulp with being a Britpop band, and obviously they are in many ways, it's like the whole story is always Stone Roses pulling out of Glastonbury, the triumphant headline set, obviously different classes, a generation-defining album, but, Pulp Sheffield years was like toil and struggle for over a decade in the 80s. It was, they would be going for 12 years before the time they kind of broke through. So, I think Pulp's time in Sheffield's a really, really interesting one, because it really is driven by this sort of dogged determination to sort of make it through. And they went through quite a lot of identity crises and stuff. But yeah, they were, of all those groups, certainly the most unique, I think. Yeah, a little bit, I mean, even by Giles' own admission, you know, a little bit geeky, but also a little bit glammy as well. You know, there was like, again, I think glam had a really big impact in Sheffield, probably again a response to people wanting to push back against their surroundings. You know, there's always been quite a bit of a dress-up element to some of these groups. So there was this, yeah, I guess, as you say, quite studious element to them, but also sort of quietly extravagant and a deep and sincere love of pop music, which, you know, was not all that common for sort of the, you know, the Rain Mac wearing brigade that was prominent in Sheffield in the 80s.
Well, here's the other thing, you see, because, you know, you cannot, people go, oh, glam, it's, you know, it's very glam or goth or any of those, or new romantics. It's very easy to be a Blitz kid in London because everybody's fashionable and the whole thing darlings. But if you, you know, as a former goth myself, you know, if you go out, you know, if you go out in 1973 dressed as a member of Sweet, you know, in Sheffield or Huddersfield, there are going to be people out there who just think they want to kick the living proverbials out of you. So it is, if you like, it's a more subversive thing to do than flouncing around in your big sister's dress.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, that was a really big thing throughout the 70s, 80s, and probably even into the 90s. I mean, it was like, you know, I remember Jarvis described walking certain parts of Sheffield as being like Pac-Man, where you would have to like avoid, he called them the beer monsters. You know, you would have to take turns down certain streets to avoid, you know, because you would be targeted. And, you know, he told me this story about, he got chased on a bus one time. He was wearing like a leather Mac or something like that, and he was being chased because of what he was wearing. And he got on the bus and he thought he'd made it just in time and flicked them the V's, but the bus hadn't taken off yet, so they just got on the bus and smacked him anyway. But yeah, no, I think if you were an oddball or an eccentric or, you know, prone to androgynous dressing or whatever, yeah, I mean, you were kind of taking your life in your hands a little bit in Sheffield. But I think the flip side to that is that it created like a community and a camaraderie amongst the weirdos and the oddballs, because there were so few of you. You got to, you know, there'd be certain pubs and venues where, you know, you could go and be that person. And so on one hand, yeah, you can't blend in as much as you can in a big city where that kind of thing's welcome. But because it forces people onto the fringes, I think that brings a lot of like-minded people together, and you end up with quite interesting sort of scenes and communities and groups of people who are drawn to one another as being outsiders, I think.
How are they getting the music? Because it's all very well being the biggest band in your town or in your city, but you've still got to get it out there. So how were they getting the music out from Sheffield to the world, as they say?
Yeah, I mean, initially they weren't. It was a huge struggle, you know. I mean, I remember speaking to Richard Kirk from Cabaret Voltaire, who sort of said, you know, he'd become so exasperated by sending out demos to London record labels and getting all of his rejection letters unified by the word unfortunately on them. You know, they were considering borrowing money from local gangsters to put out their music because it was the only means possible. You know, the Human League's first ever release was on a Scottish label, Fast Product. You know, so it wasn't really until there's a record label called Fawn in the mid-1980s, and then Warp, which was formed in 1989. So, you know, up until then, I mean, there was a little short-lived one called Aardvark that had a go, that released a compilation called Bouquet of Steel in 1980 that was sort of, but that didn't really do any work. So for a long period of time, it was just like hustling. You had to leave the city to get your music out there for some people. So yeah, there wasn't really any base of operations until the mid to late 80s in the cities. It took a long time to grow.
And what about the, you know, we talked about, let's address the long-haired elephants in the room. I mean, we've got Joe Cocker, you mentioned before, and of course Def Leppard, who a lot of people would think, you know, are the ultimate sort of big hair Americana, you know, rock band. But they're part of the British, you know, the new wave of British metal. I mean, them and Maiden and Saxon are huge players, and they do sort of, despite all the transatlantic hits, they are still very much part of the, you know, of their scene, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Def Leppard are, technically speaking, the most successful group to have ever come from Sheffield. If you're talking about it in album sales, you know, they eclipse the Arctic Monkeys quite healthily. But yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, really, because you've got that late 1970s period. I mean, it's funny that the Human League and the Def Leppard kind of break out at the same time, you know, complete polar opposites. And there's a flyer online, you can look it up actually. There's a nightclub in Sheffield called The Limit, where if you were lucky enough to go to a Monday night there in 1978, I think it was, you'd have found Def Leppard and the Human League on the same bill.
No. Genius. Imagine the backstage on that one. It was probably, I mean, not in the backstage, you know what I'm saying?
But the funny thing was, you know, Def Leppard in a way, even though, I mean, I spoke to Joe Elliott for the book and, you know, he described them as feeling like the biggest outsiders because everyone else was into this different thing and whatnot. But they did share, like, you know, there's one thing, you know, we spoke about the eclecticism of Sheffield earlier, but one thing that connects a lot of it is this really staunch sort of independent ethos and do-it-yourself ethos, mainly because, as I discussed, there's so little infrastructure in the city back in those days that you had to create things for yourself. So in a weird way, you know, sort of Def Leppard still had that. They were as ambitious and sort of almost careerist as like ABC or whatever in a way. Like, you know, they also took over an old industrial place called, I think, Stagworks, and, you know, recorded and practiced there. And, you know, they borrowed money from someone at work to press their first record. And, you know, I think Joe Elliott and his mum put them all together by hand and whatever. And, you know, the way that they ended up breaking out of Sheffield was they went to a John Peel roadshow when he was in town. Joe Elliott stormed the stage when he was on, put the record in his hand. And Peel played it, which is, you know, not a Peel type record, really.
Yeah.
And that was it. And ironically, Jarvis Cocker did exactly the same thing a year or two later with Pulp's first demo. So even though you've got these two bands who are complete polar opposites, their roots sort of out of Sheffield in a way were identical. It was the same sort of ethos, it was the same approach. So yeah, I think it's interesting that they are, on one hand, they're an anomaly, but they also kind of strangely fit in attitudinally in a way.
And also just underlines how intrinsically valuable Peel was for music in the UK. I mean, just, we will, you know, as the saying goes, we will not see his like again. You spoke to Joe Elliott. I mean, how willing are people to? Who did you speak to, and how willing were people to talk to you about this, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to a lot of people. I did over 150 original interviews for the book. So I spoke to members of Arctic Monkeys, Pulp, Cabaret Voltaire, Human League, Heaven 17, Def Leppard. So Self-Esteem, Richard Hawley, all these kinds of people. I would say for the most part, everyone was willing. The only difficulty is when you're dealing with you know, management and PR people and whatever, and because the problem is it's when you're writing a book, it's not their priority because they haven't got anything to promote. You're reliant on their goodwill. So I would say in 100% of instances where I was dealing with the artists directly, it was fine. It was only ever a headache when I was dealing with their representatives, and it would take months. But no, I think there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of love for Sheffield, and I think because people felt that this story hadn't really been fully told or documented, there was a real willingness for the most part, yeah.
And what I really like is also the fact, I mean, the Arctics, which again we haven't mentioned yet, but the way that they burst onto the scene, you know, 15 whatever years ago now, it only seems like yesterday, with that raw sound. And then I came in playing Do I Want to Know, which is a masterwork, and the way that that's evolved, but they've kept a very distinctive sound, even in the way he delivers the lyrics, and you know they're from Sheffield. And that's part of a tradition that now goes back sort of 40, 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm doing a talk on Saturday actually because it's been 20 years since their debut album, which is kind of frightening, and that coincided with my period of moving into Sheffield. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of easy to forget like how stratospheric they were, their takeoff, their liftoff, and it's kind of, and in a way, it was like they were that sort of DIY independent ethos that had driven the city for decades. It was like they were the first to do it in like the MySpace era, or they would give away CDs and stuff, which then, you know, they were like the sort of breakout success of the first file sharing era, but it's still rooted in that sort of independent spirit and community. But yeah, obviously, I think in terms of having the voice of Sheffield, probably arguably the most Sheffield band in a way, really.
What are you hoping that people will take and learn from the book, Groovy, Laidback and Nasty? And where does the title come from, by the way?
Oh, I stole it from a Cabaret Voltaire record. Well, I mean, with permission. Right. But it's an album they released in 1990 that I just always liked the title of it, and I thought it was quite emblematic of the music that's come out of the city, had a nice flow to it, and also I think Cabaret Voltaire is such an important catalyst and connecting factor to the history of music in Sheffield that I wanted to pay tribute to them as well, because I think they're a really important band, and it kind of all started with them, really.
The book is called Groovy, Laidback and Nasty. It's by Daniel Dillon Ray, who we're speaking to today. It's a history of independent music in Sheffield. If you want to order it via our own virtual bookstore, go to the website, click on it, and a well-known distribution service will have it winging its way to you. If people want to find you online, where's the best place to find you?
Probably just Instagram these days. So yeah, just search Daniel Dillon Ray and I'm there. I don't really use Twitter anymore. So yeah, drop me a line there if you want to know anything else.
The book is called Grooveback, Laidback and Nasty. It's by Daniel Dillon Ray. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.